Actually, let's say we are expecting some more members, so but we'll be guided by Susan as to what we can do, and obviously we can't make any decisions. That's the key thing. So welcome to all. We have got the Mayor joining us at about 3 o'clock, and open session on that. But I think if you can try and keep the questions mainly, I stress the word mainly, to our area of responsibility. But I'm sure there'll be odd things which you want to stray outside that. As long as that doesn't dominate the meeting, I'm more than happy for you to do that. Whether or not the Mayor would agree with that, well, we'll wait and see. So, apologies. We've got 3 apologies from Mark Hunter, Chris Goodwin, and Kate Lewis. And we haven't been able to get any replacements, have we? Alternatives. No, we haven't. Which is a bit of a shame, but we've done well in the past, so we can't always complain. Are there any declarations of interest? Thank you. Now, we can't approve the minutes. We'll have to come back to the minutes. But we can, I think, go on to the work programme, though we can't, again, finally approve the work programme. Simply. No.
I mean, in fact, the work programme is just as it stands. It's just there to know. And if there's any further updates or suggestions that people want to make to me, I think we're waiting to see whether or not the skills capital will come to December or January. I think it's like, is it still a little bit up in the air? But you'll get it prior to GMCA decision, so you have our assurance on that. But if there are any further items that you wish to be considered, just please keep us informed. And we're just about to be quora. Yes, so if there's any other items that members wish to have included, or if there's any particular focus on the listed items there. So if you don't think that we're capturing what this committee should be looking at a little bit, if you want us officers to stress a particular aspect of what for one of the updates, or if there are particular questions that you really want, you'd like to have a little bit more detail on that, please do let us know.
Just a couple of things to add. That we've got the digital and creative skills strategy, which is due to be approved in March 2019. At the moment, that's down for the meeting on the 11th of January. So that presumably may slip, depending on the actual timing of that.
I'm not sure about that one. I don't know whether Simon knows anything.
Miss, which one was it?
I just picked up in the key decisions paper that was issued early this week, but after our meeting, in fact, that the digital and creative digital strategy is due to be approved in March 2019. We're seeing the digital presentation, which will presumably include an update on that, on the 11th of January meeting. So presumably there may need to be some flexibility on when that actually comes to us.
The short answer is yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then the other thing is that what I'm very keen to do is that when we have the annual updates or the half-yearly update on the strategy, that we invite the Mayor to attend both those, or at least then we'll see the Mayor twice a year. And I think that's important, and that as a minimum. I mean, so I think if that could be scheduled for the April meeting, that would be exceedingly helpful. To be fair, I think that this time round, he wasn't to come to the September meeting, which we had to move the date of that, and that's why it's come a bit later this year. But we do need to see the Mayor, I think, to make sure that we get the political dimension as well as everything else, really. Any more questions on the work plan? So that's fine. So we can approve the updated work plan then. So can we go back to the minutes of the meeting held on the 12th of October? And are there any points to note of factual accuracy? No, in that case, can we approve them? Thank you. Right, so the next item on the agenda is the Skills and Employment Update, which is the report of Joanne Rooney.
Joanne's not here yet.
All right.
I think we're still expecting her, but I mean, probably the details will be done by Matt and Gemma anyway, so perhaps hand over to them directly.
Oh, you're happy to do that then?
Yeah, happy to do that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So as part of the papers, we've given you the Work and Skills Highlight Report, because I think this group particularly liked the format of that, because it gives you oversight of all of the activity that sits within myself and Matt's agenda. There are some key points to note throughout that for scrutiny, which I can come on to, and then we can take questions if people are happy with that. So in terms of the skills elements, just picking up on last scrutiny where we talked about adult education budget, where we are now, we have actually gone out for procurement. It went through the GMCA last month, following the really rich scrutiny discussion that we did have. One of the things that we did do that you'll see within the final paper with the GMCA, there was a lot of conversation around performance management, and we flowed that into the final paper within the GMCA, because we wanted to make sure that that was being picked up. We've subsequently, obviously now we have internal meetings and meetings with legal and with procurement to make sure how we're going to manage performance, how we're going to make sure quality is embedded within the tender process. So all of those comments have been picked up within there. Susan mentioned around skills capital, and this will come back to scrutiny. We're in the second round of skills capital in terms of the allocation of the final amount of the 71 million. And we're going through quite a rigorous appraisal process because of the values that have come in. So we've had to get external appraisers in, and we're working with those colleges as well, which is why the date is a little bit interchangeable. But you have my kind of commitment that it will come back here before it goes to the CA. We just want to make sure that we get the strategic fit of that college investment linked in with the local authority and get it to the highest standards that we possibly can. The Institute of Technology, you'll see we weren't successful within the bid for Department for Education, but what we have done is reignited the Institute of Technology board. So we have Siemens, Microsoft and Jacobs. And one of the conversations we wanted to have was, are those key employers still bought into the needs of that those skills, and how do we make sure that we're picking that up within the GMCA in terms of partners? So they were really, really committed around the digitalisation of sectors, and that flows into some of the other work around the higher skills needs of Greater Manchester. So it's just to let you know, although we didn't get the capital money, we are still on with actually how do we take a bit more of a sectoral approach to make sure that businesses are able to get the skills and the apprenticeships that they need in that sector. And then finally, just on the apprenticeship numbers, because I know we talked about this last time, yes, there has been a significant dip in apprenticeship numbers, and this is nationally. It's not all down just to the levy. There has been some significant reforms around apprenticeships, but Greater Manchester is seeing and feeling those changes. One of the papers that we brought last time to scrutiny was around the underspends, and what obviously we had the conversation about making a significant investment to stimulate demand in the SME market for apprenticeships. So again, that went through the CA, which is fantastic. We've been working with the Chamber and the Growth Hub around, right, what do we need to do to raise quality, to raise numbers, to raise completions, and then also linking that back in with the employer work that we're doing as well. So the investment will make a significant difference, and then we just need to build on that as well. So in terms of the skills, kind of a run through, I know people will have specific questions, but they were the key things that I just wanted to highlight. So I'll hand over to Matt.
Thanks, Gemma. And just on the employment side, I'll just canter through some of the kind of main areas of work at the moment. So I know we presented here previously and with a joint scrutiny committee around welfare reform, and we're bringing something back in January, where hopefully a colleague from DWP will be able to join us. But just to make you aware that we're currently doing some work with the Scottish Government and Northern Ireland to look at some of the devolved powers that they have, and some of the things that have worked well, some of the things that may not be working so well, and look at what things could be potentially be applied to somewhere like Greater Manchester, where we to go down that route. I've had a very interesting actual workshop only this morning with all of the housing associations across Greater Manchester in terms of impacts of reforms for them, and some of the key things and key changes they would like to see made along with the National Federation of Housing. So some real opportunities, I think, to put forward a collective pitch for some of the things where we could make a difference locally ourselves with some powers that we already have, but also where we think the system may require some additional changes which we can then bring to the fore. So the dashboard, which was presented here previously, is starting to give us that intelligence in terms of this is where the system currently isn't working and why in some areas. So it's given us that ability to, I suppose, to be put greater clarity, I suppose, around our ask of government. So we'll be able to give more information on that when we come back in January, but it's quite an exciting piece of work. I did want to touch on just some of the developments around working well. I know there's lots of information being provided in your packs, but there's actually some quite big figures now in terms of numbers of people who've been supported through devolved programs. So on the kind of working well pilot and expansion, so our first kind of major devolved programs for people that have worked with health conditions, it's now 18,500 people have been supported across Greater Manchester, and 3,500 almost supported into work and sustainable work. Now that's a massive impact that devolution has had in Greater Manchester. I don't want to kind of underplay that. And we've now launched the next phase of working well, which is the Work and Health programme, which went live in February. And you'll see in the highlight report that we've put an amber marking against that because we've had a slower than expected start to the programme in terms of numbers being referred. So at this moment in time, so referrals primarily, it's a voluntary programme, referrals primarily come by the job centre, and we've only had 70% of the total number of people referred to date that we would have expected. And we're seeing some people being referred numerous times, so sometimes up to 5 times onto the programme. And what that means is the figures that are published around the Work and Health programme show what we call kind of referral to start rate. So how many referrals have been made and how many starts are there? And at the minute, 7 out of every 10 people who are referred to the programme are starting. But because of the number of people who have been referred more than once, our figures are actually only 58% on referral to start rate because some people have been referred 2, 3, 4, 5 times, which is a real shame. So we're working with Jobs and Plus locally and DWP nationally to look at, well, this is a voluntary programme for people who are out of work, primarily with health conditions. We know there are 130,000 people at least in Greater Manchester claiming benefit. There should be enough people out there to benefit from this support. So what can we do collectively to try and increase those referral numbers? That's a concerted piece of action. On the kind of positive side, already 400 people have been supported into work through that programme across Greater Manchester, which is great. So when you look at the Working Well programme in totality, that's 4,000 people across Greater Manchester being supported today, which is no small number. And I wanted to touch briefly also on the Working Well Early Help programme. So you may remember this has been to scrutiny previously, so before we went out to a procurement process, which is about, in effect, how can we get more upstream to support people who are in work but struggling due to ill health, or still employed or self-employed, or have been made recently unemployed due to ill health. What can we do to intervene early to get those people back into work? And some of the key things that we said were critical were around access to occupational health, and especially for small and medium-sized enterprises, coupled with independent careers advice and things like musculoskeletal support. And since we were last at Scrutiny, we've been going through the procurement process, and we're now almost at the end of that. So I'm not in a position to tell you who's won that contract, because we're currently in what's called Alcatel period. But next week we'll be announcing the successful bidders of that programme, which is great. So in March we will have a programme to support another 11,000 people who are kind of in work and at risk of falling out of work. And for me, just one of the things I wanted to stress was we've been able to achieve this through pooling funding locally from NHS transformation funds, reform investment funds, national funding from the Joint Work and Health Unit, and European Social Fund. And for me, that's kind of devolution in action, where we've been able to move these disparate pots of funding into something around collective action with collective outcomes, and commission something collaboratively in a way that central government has been unable to. So for me, it's a real, although it's not as big in scale as some of the other Working Well programmes, in terms of actually changing the system, for me, I think it's potentially a huge milestone for us, and one that we'll want to make a big deal of when it goes live. The other element is around care and support for those further away from the labour market, which there's a separate agenda item on some of the work we're looking to do for people with learning disabilities, autism, and severe mental illness, which Anna will talk through later. And just one other thing I wanted to touch on was just around some of the work around over 50s, who we know that the employment rates across Greater Manchester are poor. There's a piece of research work underway which will come to fruition in January, after which will be some specific pieces of work. But I just wanted to update you on a couple of things that are happening now. So we're looking to launch a toolkit probably in February for both employers and advice agencies, which is just actually picking out key messages for employing older people, for the advice and guidance that could be given to them. And we're looking to launch that at the Ageing Hub conference in February. And another piece of work is around looking at flexible recruitment and flexible working practices with a national organisation called TimeWise, who certainly Manchester Council have worked with already. To look at, is that an approach we could use across Greater Manchester to, in effect, be flexible by design in terms of the job opportunities that are being created, our recruitment practices, so that they are more open to people, well, to all people, but particularly for people who are over 50. The final point on the over 50s I wanted to bring is that we're doing a more detailed labour market analysis around over 50s. So we'll look to bring that to this scrutiny committee early in 2019 in terms of what that looks like.
So on this obviously update report, are there any questions? Danny?
It's great to hear all the different people we're helping out getting back into work. I just wondered if we've done anything to do with armed services, coming out the armed services, PTSD. Obviously, I've heard that you touched on mental health. I don't know if that comes into question there. But it was just a quick question really about, do we actually offer support for people who are coming out the armed services into work?
The short answer is yes. And there is the Armed Forces Covenant that is being signed across Greater Manchester. And there's things that we do and also things that partners do. So Job Centre Plus have got some specific targeting for our armed forces. In terms of GM commissioned programmes, armed forces and service personnel have been identified as priority groups. So in terms of accessing support, those are the main things. What I could do though and come back with is actually what's the impact of those. So what types of numbers have been supported. That's something we could do for certainly for the Working Well programmes. We could do that. I don't know whether on the skills side there's anything specific that we wanted to say.
I think at the minute there isn't, because a lot of our commissioned are about young people, but particularly when the AEB kicks in, that was definitely something that we can look at as well.
Happy with that, Danny? I'm not surprised that Danny's asked that question, because in Rochdale we actually do a lot actually to support the armed forces. So I think it's dear to all our hearts, basically. So so thanks for that. Bob.
Thank you, Chair. Can we just go back onto the apprenticeship situation? And it's commendable that we're running 33%, well, 33% drop as against the national average of 40%. Have we drilled down? Do we know why such a collapse nationally or GM-wise, why that's happening?
The short answer is a lot of reasons, to be honest. I think most people will go on, it's the levy and employers aren't investing and they're not using it and it's too complicated. So that will take significant numbers. So obviously they have to set up a digital account, it's a government system, you can imagine how onerous that is. Some of the other things in terms of the standards aren't coming through as quick as possible. So they've refreshed all of the apprenticeship standards now, or a lot of them. they're not coming out of government as quickly as we'd like. So businesses are designing them, they go back into a sausage machine, and then they take a little bit of time to come out. There is different behaviour as well. So actually some of it, and we haven't got the evidence for it, is there may have been a significant drop in people doing the kind of business admin and customer service type apprenticeships because the standards are different. So what you are seeing is employers are choosing different things. So we are seeing increase in higher level apprenticeships in Greater Manchester, sectoral focus as well we are seeing. So we are seeing some positives out of it. But nationally, they'll put it down to the system is too complicated, we need to bed in the levy, and price is a massive issue in this. So are providers able to deliver at the cost? Are there end assessments? The reforms are vast and they've all just come at once. I think the thing for Greater Manchester for us is the message needs to be, come spend your levy here. We are ready, and we're working with providers and working with employers as well to understand what some of those barriers are, because what you'll find is people keep saying, we'll change the levy to a skills levy, and the Minister is quite set on, no, it needs to be an apprenticeship levy because we don't know, whether it is working or whether it's not. What you did see out of the budget was some softer wording around, we will work with employers around the levy to understand what flexibility you do need. Because like you say, nationally, there has been a significant drop, but I don't think it's one thing, and I don't think it's any one partner's kind of fault in terms of a blame game. I think it's just all come at once. And we hopefully will start to see the upturn on that, which is why GM is taking it really seriously in terms of the investment, because the SME market, that absolutely has fallen. The 16 to 18-year-olds, that's massively fallen. So in terms of the life readiness agenda, there is stuff that we need to do around that. But again, it sits within changes to technical education. So it's kind of a typical, everything kind of has come at once. And we need to tackle every single partner. So, right, what is the call to action for businesses? What is the call to action for providers? We're working with our schools really, really intensely around changing the view of apprenticeships. You'll have seen the Mayor's kind of manifesto around his UCAS-style Progress platform. We need to change perceptions. So there's lots of things that we're trying to do at a GM level to try and bust some of those numbers, to be honest.
Can I just add to that, actually? I mean, and as my understanding, it is a number of complex things. But all what you were doing was the problems in terms of getting the apprenticeship place available and the interaction with skills and the new technical qualifications. But is there a desire there amongst children to actually take up apprenticeships? Or is that, are they viewed in the way in which they shouldn't be? I'm a complete supporter of apprenticeships. And if you think about my background was accountancy, everybody thinks that's technical. You learn your accountancy job on the job. It's probably one of the best examples of an apprenticeship. And yet nobody would say it was an apprenticeship. So, I mean, I'm just hoping that we are getting the right message out to, and it's a cultural thing perhaps, to children. This is one of the best ways in which you can actually create for yourself a really good career in so many areas where, some of the traditional routes are not necessarily the best way of going around. So it's really this cultural thing, and whether or not there is a pent-up demand there with children, because that's the driving force as well.
Yeah, and this is the work that we're trying to do around Bridge GM and the work that we are doing with schools. You're absolutely right. There is a perception around apprenticeships, and we need to change that. And, it's a parental thing. It's a cultural thing, like you say. There has been a significant change now, so schools have to let colleges and providers in, because I think there was some of that in terms of there's an academic route. I think there's a complexity issue. An academic route, you go on, you do your A-levels and your path is set. The apprenticeship and the technical market is so overly complicated that we need to kind of break that down a little bit, and that's some of the stuff we're trying to do in GM. But again, what you are seeing is people are taking up degree-level apprenticeships much more. So there is some significant shifts. I think one of the other things you are seeing is people are using their levy to upskill and progress people. So in work progression and older workers, we are seeing significant changes there. So there are some positives. I think But again, the messages for the young people themselves, it just needs to be really simple, and that's what we're trying to do. So under the kind of career platform is, you know, the Mayor and Greater Manchester, we want all of our young people to have a clear line of sight to every opportunity, whether that's an apprenticeship, whether that's some work shadowing, whatever that is, so that people think that they can do it and that is their route. And so that under the life readiness agenda is one of the main drivers for that, is to break down some of those perceptions.
Susan and then Danny.
Thanks, Chair. First of all, I want to ask about, just to be clear about any relationship between working well and working health, because you told us, of course, you've got, in a sense, some slow uptake there. So is that because you've done so well with working well? Do you feel that some of the engagement now around working health is those that perhaps would have found it harder to engage on working well? Is there a relationship there? And then the other thing I'm very interested in, even though you've had such success with working well, did childcare feature at all? Were there issues about people being able to think about wanting to work because they, as well as other issues in their lives, they also, you know, had children, or even perhaps where people care for loved ones and relatives and so on, and would need some assistance with that? Thanks.
So just in terms of the relationship between working well and working health programs, so to an extent, Greater Manchester is at a slight disadvantage to the rest of the country, because we've had a working well programme since 2014, which has been supporting people out of work with health conditions, which hasn't been available elsewhere in the country. So therefore, to an extent, Job Centre Plus has been, for want of a better word, kind of fishing in that pool for a period of time already, where that hasn't been the case elsewhere. So that's one of the... So that is an issue. However, there are still over 100,000 people in Greater Manchester, if not more, who could support from this. So although, yes, there is a correlation between the two, I'd be loath to say, well, we should lower our expectations because we've had something before, because actually there are already enough people. There are enough people who can be supported, who currently aren't getting the support that they need. So, but yes, there is a correlation between the two. In terms of childcare, yeah, that has come up as an issue, and I can't remember whether I've said this last time or not. But interestingly, on the Working Well expansion, so we extended the groups who could be supported through the programmes from purely to start off with people claiming employment support allowance with health conditions to other groups, including lone parents with young children. And interestingly, they have been our most successful group of supporting into work. And some of that has been simply about brokering relationships with their childcare providers as well, and with some of our early help teams across the conurbations. But there still is a barrier to work for many people with young children around the accessibility of childcare provision, both in terms of cost, and although there's been lots brought in over the past few years in terms of increasing the amount of free childcare available at an earlier age, but it's also to do with the location and times when childcare is available. So especially as we've got things like 24-hour retail and other things. So if you're working in the day, then it's fine. In the evening, then it still is an issue that we're working on.
Okay, Susan. Danny.
I just wanted to come off the back of what you said, Mike, in regards to apprenticeships and people, like people not wanting to do apprenticeships. And I'm not trying to be political when I make this statement now, but there is reasons to why people don't want to do apprenticeships, and that is the low wages that you do get at an apprenticeship level. I know that you do end up coming out of a skill, but sometimes these apprenticeships go on for 4 years. And I know that some of my friends, when they were looking at doing apprenticeships or going into full-time work, went into full-time work because you got paid more, and then you could work your way up and you could do apprenticeships from that. Because I know that in Rochdale with our high-end apprenticeships, we do actually offer, I'm trying to think of the word now, we do actually offer money to the actual candidates who are doing it to actually try and get them through that and give them money at the end. So it's just a quick question really off the back of that. Do we actually do anything in regards, do we give any money out to providers to see if we can get people through apprenticeships to actually offer them a bit more than what they're getting. Because obviously, one of my blows was when I was younger, is I got EMA, and then all of a sudden the people who were younger than me didn't get EMA. And the problem is people aren't getting enough money to carry on training, because that's what you survive on these days, money, isn't it? So I just wondered, was there any actually financial gains to actually getting an apprenticeship that are actually given out by GM or providers, etc.?
Just add there, you make a valid point there. We focus on apprenticeships for a good reason, but it's not a one size fits all. It's what's important for individuals. I think that's the key thing.
So in terms of financial subsidies, there aren't any that we hand out, but what we are trying to do, particularly in the public sector, is change that. So actually change the wages for apprenticeship. So all of our public sector now have gone to national minimum wage for age. There's an ambition to get that to living wage. So we're trying to do it for ourselves in terms of, practice what you preach kind of a thing. I think this will come up within the consultation around the Mayor's Charter as well, in terms of, good business practices. It is a national issue, and we are trying to break down some of those barriers in some of the research that we've been doing and working with young people and their parents, because there were some comments around, if I take an apprenticeship, my housing benefit stops and all of that. So actually working with JCP to actually understand, is that real or is that perceived? But actually giving the money out to the learner, that's not something that we've done, but what we're trying to do is incentivise providers with the SME grant to take on an apprentice and therefore pay them, a job. It's a job. It's not an apprenticeship. It's a job at the end of the day. So, yeah, we are looking at it, but I think the starting point is let's practice what we preach within the public sector and increase that, from the apprenticeship wage.
Can I just say that is actually very positive to hear, so thank you.
Valerie.
Could I ask you, please, under your bridge programme summary, you talk about 257,000 so on young people gaining a quality experience with an employer. How do you know that? And how do you define quality experience?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think the perception of what careers information has been over the years has been, somebody standing up and doing a talk, or you get a leaflet, or you get told in my world that I was going to be a librarian. So what we've done through the Bridge programme is about quality assurance. So under the Bridge programme, there are enterprise coordinators that work within that school and connect them to the business. So all of those schools that are working through what's called the Gatsby benchmarks. So it's a national benchmark framework that they have to work to. And all of those encounters have to reach a certain standard for them to be able to be captured. So it's not the old-fashioned, here's a leaflet, oh yeah, that's great, or oh, I've had a talk, I've definitely got careers advice now and I know where I'm heading. So what we're trying to do is ensure that we embed the benchmarks so that people are getting the gold standard of careers education in all of their encounters.
Karen.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm pleased to hear about the single parents, because that's been a great concern, I know, with yourself and other people, and I'm pleased to hear that the take-up has increased, because it is important that we accept that there are a large number of women and men who actually have got to look after children. And also, I just wondered where that fitted in with carers of parents, because, quite a lot of us are looking after our parents as well. So I just wonder how you actually deal with that. And also our care facilities within, we've got young carers who are within schools. Are they being picked up? Because I do think that they will probably need support. And secondly, I'm pleased to hear that the techs are actually going into our schools now and being accepted. That's a positive statement. But could I just ask on priority 4, the Education and Employment Board, could you tell me who is on this board? Who are they? And who do they represent? And the second one was about the secondary school performance. It says in here the final report is available. Could you tell me where I can actually pick that up? Because I think we need that info with regards to the report that's been done. And I think it's something that we should be looking at. Thank you.
Can I just add to that, actually, in terms as well of the Education and Employability Board, the terms of reference has now been finalised. It should be useful as well to have a link to that. I don't need to hard copies, but a link for both that and the report would be very helpful for some background information.
Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of the education and employability, this is a board that came out of the Children's Review quite a while ago. And what we've ensured is that board and then the newly refreshed Employment and Skills Advisory Panel are kind of linked. So we're talking about that continuum from education all the way up into work. So it's chaired by Mel Ainscoe, who is a professor at the Manchester University. And I can definitely get the terms of reference because they have been signed off now. And it's directed to Children's Services, the school heads on there, there's a college on there, the Combined Authority sits on there, and obviously the oversight is under Rishi Shori as the children's lead. And they've got 3 kind of clear actions now. So it's taken quite a while to think about what the role is and where they wanted to focus their activity and how do we link that then with the skills agenda. So they're focusing on a piece of work around maths within school, because we know that we've got an attainment issue around maths within some of our secondary schools, so linking with the HE within that. Work around, and then 2 pieces of work around the disadvantage. So what the research shows you, and I'll send it, it may crash everybody's inbox, so apologies. But I'll send that, and what that shows is it takes that journey from early years all the way up. So it says, you know, actually we're doing all right in primary, and actually then what happens, but it drills down, it's really quite interesting, into specific cohorts, so we know where we're doing really quite well, and we are busting some of those myths about all schools are bad, because they're not, they're doing a fantastic job. And then actually, but what we see is certain groups of individuals, particularly SEND, aren't doing or making as much progress as their kind of counterparts, and people on free school meals as well. So it's a really kind of highlights the social mobility and the kind of poverty angle. So we can share that because it's helped us then pick up some of that work around NEAT, particularly with our ESF programmes. Around where do we need to focus the activity, where do we need to target. So that's where the Education and Employability Board sits in, and then we make sure that we make that transition on the employment and skills, because obviously post-16 we also see the same problems.
Before I come to my questions, are there any more questions to be raised? I've just got a couple. It's a bit of detail really in some ways. Under the Bridge report, we've now got 156 schools and colleges signed up to the Enterprise Advisor Network, and there are 83 Enterprise Advisors. Now, we've had some analysis in the past of where these are across the Combined Authority. I think an updated list of that, I don't know all the detail, but just to give a broad indication of where they are. And I guess each of the representatives who will be interested, I think, to find out if there are any big gaps in their own local authorities. So that would be just a helpful. I don't want, again, crash, if you like, systems. You know, it's pretty high level, really. The next point that I had was on digital skills, and 2 points there. First of all, on the digital skills itself, progress is yellow. It's on page 27. Reading it, I couldn't see why it wasn't green. So what am I missing there? And just below that is the Institute of Technology, where we remember that we actually lost out on the stage 1 funding. But I thought that slightly different to connotation of the word, I thought that we were so signed up to what needs to be done there that we said that even though we haven't got that funding, we will find our own funding to go ahead with this programme, which is not quite what it says here. So could you just clarify that for me, please? And I think that was it.
So I preempted your question. So I have got a very easy spreadsheet around all of the schools that are involved, and there is really good representation across every area, which is fantastic. And we can also show which businesses are in there as well, and give you a bit of a flavour as to what they're doing. So yeah, I had that handy. In terms of the digital skills, I think we're just erring on the side of caution, really. So yes, there is some fantastic activity. We've been out to tender for part of that action plan, and you'll have seen as well that in the budget we got some money for digital skills. So we're just working with DCMS and Treasury on that about developing what that looks like. I think the Institute of Technology, you're absolutely right, as I said in the intro, there is absolute appetite, and we just wanted to sense check that with the businesses. There's been some other changes around the successful around Made Smarter. So what we want to make sure is that we're not kind of going off on our merry way. We're actually linking it into some of the things that are out there already, but particularly, like I say, Microsoft's, Jacobs and Siemens talking around their supply chain, particularly around the kind of IR4 and the digitalisation. They absolutely kind of see that they need certain skills, their supply chain needs certain skills, and at this moment in time, the barriers that we talked about before, particularly in the apprenticeship market, it's not coming through quick enough. I think the difference than what I saw was, did we need a capital investment? And what actually came out of the conversation the other week was, let's have a look at where the gaps are, and let's look at what we are collectively doing as opposed to let's ask for a resource. So there's a lot of activity at the higher level skills in terms of the universities have really picked it up. But because of the changes in technical education and changes in apprenticeships, that pathway through, that's where we're getting a little bit stuck. So that's some of the work that we will absolutely pick up.
Whole area, and it's good to see them. Obviously, it's mainly green, some yellow, no reds, which is important. I think there's a bit more information that we'd like to obviously have, which obviously Susan's got those details, and we'll minute that, which is really by way of to understand, if you like, what the issues they all face and if you like, the whole population's facing, really. Another thing, I guess, is making sure that we are doing whatever we can do, not just to push apprenticeships, but as Danny says, the other forms of help that can be given to young people to get gainful employment. At the end of the day, they're the future of this conurbation. So it's and it clearly has been difficult. And the thing with apprenticeship, it's not a Greater Manchester problem. It's a UK problem. But it's certainly from my perspective, it's something we have to get right. But I suspect it will not be an easy path to get it right. So in that case, we're now on to 6A, which is the specific presentation on the Working Well Specialist Employment Service.
I'll just do a very quick introduction and hand over to Anna, who's actually doing all the work on it. So we've spoken previously around the Working Well programs which are currently in place. So the Working Well Work and Health programme for those who are with health conditions who are some way from the labour market but not too far away. We're just about to launch the Working Well Early Help for people who are kind of either at risk of falling out of work or recently unemployed. This strand of work is about actually those who've got some of the worst employment rates in Greater Manchester and some of the most complex needs, where actually there's a real dearth of provision, and this is about what can we do to test something to increase the quality and quantity of provision across Greater Manchester around some specific groups. So there are some asks of this, but which it's still at relatively early stage of development, so there may be things that you can't answer at the moment or can't direct, but we were quite keen to come here to make sure you were aware of some of the plans, have an opportunity to contribute to it before we take those next steps. So with that, I'll hand over to Anna.
Hi, so I'm Anna Twells and I'm a Principal Manager for Employment in the Skills and Work team in the Combined Authority. So I've got a very short presentation, a few slides, and then I'm obviously aware there'll be some questions, and we've already had some questions from the Chair as well, which we can respond to. What we're looking to do is procure a new GM specialist employment service for 3 population groups, as Matt has mentioned. So people with learning disabilities, people with severe mental illness and autistic people. And again, as Matt has said, these are groups who have low employment rates and for which we have sort of limited and patchy service provision at the moment in GM. So some localities have more service provision than others, and this is about us looking at what can we do at a GM level to contribute to improving that situation. So it's a joint combined authority and health and social care partnership project. And in the partnership, we're working with a number of different colleagues. So colleagues from adult social care transformation, colleagues from adult mental health transformation, and there's also a health and employment strategic lead. So it's a joint project group. Because it's a GM project and because of the groups in scope, we've also got stakeholders beyond that from a commissioning side. So we've also been linking in with local authority and CCG commissioners. So we've got quite a lot of different stakeholders here. Just to say that we're using the phrase specialist employment service as an umbrella term. So by that we mean supported employment and individual placement and support. So they are ultimately almost the same thing. So these are service models that are designed for people with complex needs, with disabilities, to help them into paid work in the open labour market, so real jobs. And they share many of the features of a typical employment programme, but there's a lot more intensive support and staff have smaller caseloads and take a much more proactive approach to working with employers to identify employment opportunities and then provide ongoing support for people once they're in work. The real key difference between IPS and supported employment is that IPS is the model for people with severe mental illness, and it's been designed in such a way that there is a set of quality standards, if you like, and the closer that your service operates to the quality standards, evidence shows the better outcomes that you get. So for the SMI group, it's IPS. For the other 2 groups, it's supported employment. But broadly speaking, same principles, same sort of service model. Just for a bit of context from the health and employment side of things, and I've no doubt that the committee will have seen this model before, but the partnership and the CA have a joint programme of work around health and employment, and the model on this slide is called the Working Well system, and this sets out our population health approach to this. So there are 4 strands, as you can see, from care and support on the left, which Matt has already mentioned, to in-work on the right, and the arrow at the top represents distance from the labour market. So the care and support cohort, which is broadly speaking, people on employment and support allowance support. These are people with really complex needs and they're the furthest away from the labour market. And in terms of this service and the groups that we're looking at, broadly speaking, that's where we think these people will be. And it's an area where we haven't done that much at a GM level so far, so we'd like to do something at this end of the model of our population health approach. A little bit about funding, because it's very important. The committee will be aware that GMCA is a European Social Fund co-financing organisation, and as such we can make somewhere in the region of around 2 million, possibly a bit more, available to support the commissioning of a new service. But obviously to access that money we need match, and that match needs to be cash. So the majority of the match for that will be coming from the partnership, from the GM Mental Health Transformation Fund. So as you can see there, that's 1.7 million. And this is money that is specifically for IPS, for people with severe mental illness, and it's to respond to a must-do within the 5-year forward view for mental health. So that gives us a pot of 3.4 million that we know that we have. We've had so regarding the shortfall, which is 300,000 cash, we've had some initial conversations with directors of adult social services and heads of commissioning in local authorities about whether or not they might be able to contribute to that, because we'd really like to get to the pot of 4 million if possible. And obviously this would be over the contract period, so you're talking about 3.5 years, whatever that might be. So we've had some initial conversations, and that's something that we need to follow up with them. And the reason why we are not going to CCGs with that request is because the existing cash match that we have is NHS funding, so that's transformation funding, so that's why it's a request to local authorities. We don't know what the response will be, but that's something we're going to pursue in a paper to wider leadership team in, I think, December. So again, a point about the ESF is that to do this, to access this money, GMCA has to be the commissioner of what would be a new service. There isn't any other way of doing this. We can't allocate this funding out to localities. And we believe that bringing the ESF and the mental health transformation pot together is the best thing to do. So we've got the money for the mental health, and then we've got some ESF for the other two groups in scope. And again, just to clarify, we have been stressing to local authorities that this isn't about localities disinvesting in current services. So there is some supported employment provision across GM that local authorities invest in. There's one IPS service, that's very limited provision, which obviously I think it's Manchester Health and Care Commission invest in. This is about doing more, and in fact one of the conditions of ESF is that it's about additionality, so it can't pick up disinvestment in existing domestic services. So that's really important here. This is how can we provide more provision. There's one more slide. Okay. That's the point. Sorry, that's just the summary questions, but just to say, in terms of a few things, in terms of length, we'd be looking at a contract that's a minimum of 36 months. Because of how the ESF works, the last claims for ESF would need to be in mid-2023, so the maximum length of the contract is going to be probably now just under 4 years, taking into account a procurement timeline. And what we've heard so far from providers is that longer is better in terms of mobilising a service and setting something up, so that's another sort of key piece of information. But that's a broad summary of what we're looking to do.
Before I throw out the questions, one point that I did raise, I think, and it's probably the way in which this report is written, but I think you've explained it now, actually, because it always implied down here, under page 43, 1.6, it said that the latter funding could potentially be transferred directly to localities to establish individual placement support provision, but this would remove the option of matching with ESF. So what you're saying is, that really isn't an option. I mean, I read it in there as an option, but what you're saying, if you want to maximise your funds available, that isn't an option at all, really, because you're going to lose 1.7 million.
I would agree, right? It shouldn't be an option. I suppose it always could have been, but yes, it does remove that opportunity for match, and it removes the opportunity to do something for people with learning disabilities and autism, which we think is very important. Again, I think it's like the point Matt made earlier. This is about how can we come together in GM and make the most of what we've got to meet people's needs.
Questions? Valerie.
Thank you. You have a chart in Appendix 2, which is on page 50, which shows quite dramatically different rates of employment in different parts of the authority. Could you explain some of that discrepancy?
I'll start by sort of explaining the table. So the data in the table here relates to people with learning disabilities, and it's specific data that's compiled through the Adult Social Care Outcomes Framework. So one of the first things to say is this isn't everybody in GM with a learning disability. This is people who are known to adult social care and in receipt of services for a primary reason of a learning disability. And the National Audit Office, they estimate that this cohort of people is something in the region of 15.5% of working age adults with a learning disability. So it's a small number. In terms of the discrepancy, it's an interesting question. There's some huge discrepancy, isn't there, going from sort of your 1.1% of people in Manchester. I think there'll be a few things. I think there'll be some issues with data collection, so I don't think this is very good quality data. Potentially some issues about which areas offer support to this group in terms of services, which areas don't. I wouldn't like to say that this is anything to do with the wider labour market, and the reason why I say that is because the National Audit Office have suggested that it's nothing to do with the wider labour market. But other than that, I think it's difficult to describe the discrepancies, but it is quite marked, isn't it?
So there aren't any lessons for us in Oldham that we could learn from some of our neighbours?
I think what's probably one of the things that's not in the paper in any great detail is colleagues in the partnership carried out an exercise to map supported employment provision in GM, and as far as I'm aware, Oldham was commissioning very little, and I think possibly wasn't commissioning a service at all, but might have been working with people around how they use their personal budget. I couldn't say that that was 100% accurate, but certainly areas such as Stockport and Trafford have invested more money in supported employment and have done so for longer and have retained that investment when others have disinvested. My only reticence around that being the only explanation is that this is a population level indicator and isn't service data. It's multiple factors, but if we took the information on investing in services, there are some areas that do, and there are some, invest a fair amount, and some areas that invest very little.
I mean, it's a valid point. I mean, there are some stark differences there, actually. So, I mean, I suspect, all of us might have similar issues, and I suppose initially take it up with like, our own local authorities and feed it back, into the guys sure afterwards, perhaps. Danny?
I know you mentioned during the presentation this is like a new thing, and it's offering another service on top of that. So would you still be working with, obviously, the groups that are commissioned within the boroughs to actually improve their service? Is that what the full fund's about?
So do you mean the other supported employment services? We'll definitely need to make sure we've got an interface with those services in terms of what will this service do, what do they do, and how do we manage referrals. I don't actually know a lot about the quality of services and how they assess their quality, and it's certainly a conversation that we could have. There are quality standards, but it's probably at the moment it's more that relationship between we're going to add something new in, and how do we make sure that people know how to refer, where to refer, any differences between the services. It's certainly something we could think about.
Because I know I'm glad that this presentation's come, actually, because this has alerted me to, obviously, services that I didn't even realise that we commissioned out as Rochdale Borough Council, to be honest. So when I get back, I'll be having a look at what services we actually commission, how we can actually work with you on this as well. Because if this, obviously, we've said about the discrepancies within this table, but we need to obviously be doing data collection appropriately and properly, because otherwise these sectors within society won't be getting the support that they need from the local authorities and for Greater Manchester.
Susan.
Thank you. Anna, thinking about these categories, so for example, mental illness, how are the workers, I'm interested in who the workers are and what their backgrounds are and what training and education you might feel you've wanted them to have. How are they going to do things like avoid stigma in the sense that I was thinking, will much of it have to be aimed, for example, at assisting people to maybe work maybe in factories or in paint shops and so on and so forth? Because my understanding is that you've got people with mental illness and, as you've said, some with learning difficulty and possibly autism and Asperger's is linked to quite achieving intelligence, isn't it? So how will you avoid the stigma if there are those that, I think if they're quite well, if they can go through periods of really quite good health, where they could work, in jobs that challenge them creatively, actually, challenge them creatively, and challenge their minds if they've got some good intelligence.
You're right in that there's some quite distinct needs and some different groups there. Interestingly, recently I was looking at some of the data from Bradford's IPS service, so specifically for people with severe mental illness, and the range of jobs that people got was incredibly broad. Like the sectors that people work in is very, very broad. I couldn't say the same or answer that question about people with learning disabilities and autism, because actually there's less information available about the types of sectors that people go into in their jobs. And one of the things that I didn't say is that as per Early Help and the Working Well Working Health programme, we do want to commission an evaluation. And some of the things we want to be able to collect is information about what types of jobs do people get in these groups, amongst other things. So I think the severe mental illness group do a very broad range of jobs, and I could provide some information on that. Employment specialists who work in these services, I suppose tackling that stigma, both with employers, but also people's perception of themselves and their capability, is a core part of their job, really. So it's really important for each of what they do.
May I have a subsequent question, Chairman? It seems obvious to me then that would not the GMCA and the local authorities need to role model as well?
Yes, is the short answer to that. There's a point towards the end of the paper where I think I've mentioned that we need to think about leading by example. So at the end of January, I'm going to one of the GM HR directors meetings along with a colleague called Jo Finnerty from the partnership, and she works on adult social care. She's an adult social care workforce lead within the partnership. So we're going to have that conversation. It will include the partnership and GMCA about what we don't know at the moment is anything about baselines of who do we employ in these groups, because we may already have some good practice. So it's that conversation about what do we know at the moment, what are we doing at the moment, what else could we do. So that's certainly something that we intend to pick up.
Jude.
Okay, thank you. I'm really pleased to see that this is on the agenda. I think we're failing a lot of people in Greater Manchester by actually ignoring the needs in terms of the support, the specialist support that a lot of people need. One of the things I wanted to ask is, when you go for big contracts, one of the benefits of the kind of current providers is that they're local and have good relationships. And one of the benefits in Stockport, if I speak about my locality, is that they have really strong relationships with the sector, including, you know, employers and the local economic forum. So that's my question. You know, big isn't always beautiful. My second comment is, there's an economic case for supporting people into employment, not least that people end up in long-term support in today's services that are not meeting their needs. And that narrative I don't see, so I'm really interested in sort of hearing about the economic issues around supporting people into employment. And the other thing is, picking up on people's points about good practice, some really good models are the supported internships that are working in health sectors, in college, you know, with local colleges supporting those. And as public sector employers, I really like to see us being exemplars in promoting those across all our workplaces, really, because they work really well for people and the outcomes around support internships are really positive.
I might take those questions backwards. So your last point, obviously, about the supported internships, you're right, we do need to do more around sharing the good practice, and certainly that conversation that we'll have with the HR directors will be about those pathways to employment as well as employment services. So that's something that we can look at and address. In terms of the economic case, I think it might not be referred to in any great detail in this paper, but there's a particular academic called Dr. Stephen Bayer who does a lot of work on the economic case for supported employment, particularly for LD, possibly also autism. And his work has found a range of benefits, so savings to the welfare benefit system, savings to social care, examples where people who end up in employment have found that their income has increased, also value around well-being and other factors. And certainly one of the things we'll be doing in the combined authority is a cost-benefit analysis to try and understand that. So that will be using the existing evidence that's available to us. But then you review that as you go along, as you get service performance once you've done that. So we will be looking at that. And yes, there is an economic case. And in fact, Dr. Stephen Bayer did quite a large paper for a European organisation whose name escapes me, but he looked at a whole range of policy and practice measures around helping people with disabilities into work. And in fact, the two measures, so this could include things like incentives for employers, but the two measures that were found to have been the most cost effective were supported employment and IPS. So that's part of the reason why we're pursuing what we're pursuing. Was your first question being that you're concerned about how we procure this and the types of providers that might be able to tender for the service? So one of the things that we've put in the paper is about, was a question around lotting. Because we have a choice here. There's no conditions attached to this funding that mean we need to do it in a certain way. And I think when we originally started to think about this, we were thinking one contract. But as we've started to have conversations with colleagues and with providers, we've started to think that lotting might be a better strategy and therefore mean that it's more attractive to smaller providers. Because as you say, we know there are a number of smaller providers who operate in this field. The other aspect is we need to think about payment models as well. And payment models, there are some payment models that prohibit certain sizes of providers going for contracts. So there's two things that we can think about there really that will help with that. We have started some informal dialogue with providers. So there's a supported employment task group who we've spoken to who are linked to the Learning Disability Strategy. This morning I was at the British Association of Supported Employers Network meeting and talking about this service and getting a bit of feedback. So these kinds of things have come up. And then we're doing a workshop that IRSA, the Employment Related Service Association, are organising with us, where, again, we will tell providers about this service, we will take their questions, but we will also have questions for them. So things like how do we procure this? How do we look at pricing structures to mean that we're not making it difficult for some providers will be part of that. We do appreciate that ESF will not be attractive to some providers, but that is the funding pot that we have. So hopefully we'll try and address that.
Are you happy with that, Jude? Okay.
Thanks, Chair. Just going back to the table on Appendix 2 on page 50, with the different performances by the different local authorities. I know you did explain partly that you thought it was because of past history of spending on the service by different authorities, but I assume it's a bit more complicated than that. And I just wondered whether we, not now, but whether we could delve down on that, into that a bit, because if we're going to get extra money, you know, it may be if one authority is actually spending the same as another authority and getting better results, then it'd be interesting to know why and how we could apply lessons learned really to improve the performance of everybody. And even those who are performing well are not performing all that brilliantly. I know Trafford's top of the list there, but it's still only 14%. I think we could, you know, I'd like to see us improve on that as well, not just the low one. So that was one question. The other short question, Chair, is what's going to happen to the ESF after, if and when Brexit ever occurs?
I'll take the first one and Matt can answer the second one. I think going back to that table, it's multiple factors. So I've looked at trends over time with this, with 3 years of data. So full year data, this is 1 quarter. And I can tell you that with I'm sure it was Rochdale, where it was really low and then it went up hugely. And that might have been data collection. There's other factors. So there's data collection, there's potential investment, there's potential around... escapes me what else I was going to say, but there's loads of reasons as to why this could be the case. And what I would say is this is a population level indicator, and that helps us understand where there are issues that we want to address. So we certainly can try and look at it in more detail, but it will be multiple factors. But what we need to do here is when we procure a service is measure the performance of that service and assess the value for money of that and benchmark that against existing practices. We assume services contribute to changing population level indicators, but they're not necessarily the only factor. And whilst I appreciate these are quite small numbers, so I think it's just over 6,500 people, it will be a number of different things that cause this. But I think looking at trends over time is actually helpful. So choosing one reason that's shifted a figure or means the difference between one locality and another would be really quite hard.
Danny?
I just quickly noticed something that actually wasn't mentioned in the report itself, and I did try and quickly skim read it. So if I have missed it, I completely apologise. But in regards to getting people with learning difficulties and severe mental health into work, I'm thinking about younger people here who have... Are we not working with like SEN providers, schools, along the lines of that, just to obviously push people, well, not maybe push people, but you know what I mean, to encourage people to go into work, and if work's not for them, you know, maybe try and do something else along the lines, because I know with my sister's got autism, so I do have a good knowledge about this and a good experience of it. It's like she tried work, she couldn't do work because she couldn't understand what they were asking her to do and stuff like that. And I understand you want to put more help into to employers to actually support people with autism. But it was just a quick question of whether we actually are in schools, SEN, to try and like bring a bit of normality and a bit of routine into work, really.
Thanks. It's a really valid point, and that's some of the work that we talked about in terms of the Education and Employability Board and the work of Bridge. So when we are working with schools, we're also working with the SEND schools as well, and also SEND leaders within those schools to make sure that we target the support. So the careers support it's a universal offer and it's there for the school, but actually for those young people that need slightly more or more kind of intensive support, that's what we're able to do because we're into that school. The Careers Hub that is mentioned in the update, we've actually got a trio of SEND schools as well, which can all learn from each other in terms of careers and bringing those employers in, again, to break down some of the barriers in employers' views, but also for them to understand and kind of raise the aspiration of everybody within that school. So yeah, it's absolutely something that we're looking at and pushing on. And then particularly in the ESF NEAT programme, we've got a specific around targeting SEND in that. So I think we are trying to kind of pick up from what the research has showed and what the evidence is showing, how do we make sure that we're creating that pathway. So apprenticeships might be one thing, but actually what about the pre-employment stuff, and how are we making sure that we are getting somebody from that kind of 14, 15, 16, what is their pathway all the way through, no matter their background.
I generally do think we need to push it, because it's like you're saying, when my sister left school, the only thing they wanted her to do was like life skills or something like that. She already knew life skills and stuff like that. It was just about having that support within work in apprenticeships, and I think that's where we need to push it a bit more and get rid of that stigma there.
Sam, you want to come in on one of these points?
I was just going to answer Barry's question about the future of ESF rather than his question about when Brexit was going to happen. Just on the future of ESF, the government has said that whatever happens with Brexit, they will honour the funding that would have come to the UK and therefore to Greater Manchester under the current ESF programme, and that's why we're able to access this money up till 2022, which is the normal time frame we would have been accessing European programmes up to. After that point, ESF and ERDF, the Regional Development Programme, will be replaced by something called the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. The government's going out to consultation on exactly how that will operate and the details behind it. It was supposed to be autumn. I'm now keep on being told it's later this year, but we haven't got much more of this calendar year to go. But there is going to be a government consultation on that shortly.
Thank you. I've got a couple of things, actually. On figures, page 51, and we've got the individual placement support in England as measured in 2016-17 rate per 100,000 STP population. Great variations, which in a way you could expect that because you're looking at shire counties and large conurbations. But one thing I can't get my mind around is why Greater Manchester 1.4 and West Yorkshire, which ought to be pretty comparable, is 31.6, which is a massive difference. Anything you can share with us on that?
I can. I think this might be part... So this isn't about prevalence of mental illness, it's about access to services. And I'll explain why I did this table. So not every STP area responded to the audit around IPS provision. So it's, I think, 23 out of the 44 or 22 out of the 44, something like that. When you look at the figures, it looks like GM is the second worst after the Black Country. but it isn't, because our population is much bigger. So that's why I changed it to a rate per 100,000 population. And the simple answer when you said about West Yorkshire and us is that West Yorkshire invests more in IPS. So they spend more on it and they have more places. So that's why our figures are worse than theirs. The reason why I did that rate per 100,000 general population as opposed to anything about the population with mental illness was entirely pragmatic, in that that data is readily available, whereas otherwise I could have been sourcing several pieces of data to add something up. But it makes the point I wanted to make is that we don't have the second worst in this audit, we have the worst.
I did read that actually in the report, and these, you know, in terms of figures, you can make anything out of them basically, but it was that concern, that comparison between something like West Yorkshire, and you mentioned before, and in some of the figures, I mean, we're not quite sure if some of the figures are spot on, which we'll come back to in your areas there. So I'm not sure we can put any observations on the proposed funding split across the population groups, because we don't know, you don't know, if those figures are accurate. In due course, hopefully you'll get accurate figures, and you can perhaps refine that. The other point that I had, actually, I just didn't understand this, I have to say, and this is on page 53, and this is about what might increase investment in specialist employment services in GM Deliver. And it says it's been assumed that 2/3 of those placed into paid work will sustain it for 13 weeks. And around 50% of those placed into paid work will sustain it for 26 weeks. So is my interpretation that we spend this money, people come in for 13 weeks, and after 13 weeks, they go off and do something different. Or they may stay for 26 weeks, and then they go something different. I just don't understand because obviously what we're looking for is sustainable employment with good employers who are caring employers, and that's what we should be looking for, to try and support that impetus. So it might be me completely misreading what's in there, but I frankly just didn't understand it.
Yeah, that's a very valid question. What I was trying to do is just so people will start so a proportion of people who come into the service will start a job, they'll start in paid work. And like many employment services, over time, some people will fall out of paid work. So I was just trying to give an indication of what we might see happen. And those figures about what might happen at 13 weeks and 26 weeks, they come from some modelling done by the IPS Grow Consortium, so some experts in IPS about what long-term job sustainment is likely to look like. There isn't anything equivalent that I've come across for supported employment for LD and autism. So I guess you're right, we want people to be able to stay in work in the long term. That isn't necessarily what happens. And one of the things that we would want to do as part of our performance management and our evaluation is try and understand a bit better across the three population groups what happens. Of course, the services will continue to support people. So, for example, if there's a change in someone's employment circumstances, they can go back in and support that person and work with their employer as well. So there's that long-term sustained support. But it was just, realistically, not everyone who starts a job stays in the job, and that was the best sort of available data. But it is very confusing, all that stuff. It confuses me every time I do the numbers, but it was just trying to give a bit of an indication of what might happen.
In that case, it does worry me that the percentages are very high. That I would have wished, I think is the word, wished that people would be in gainful employment for longer periods of time. That seems to be very short, and therefore I would question whether or not what you're getting is, I don't want to use the word value for money because that's an awful connotation in this sort of thing, but getting, if you like, for the individuals concerned, you're getting the right things for them, I think. And I think that's what I would challenge. So I think, doing this sort of thing, there is a need for this, absolutely, in my judgment. But it's making sure that things are done properly and the employers are not taking advantage, or they're doing things as they should be doing as caring employers. So, which I think is something I think to be taken away, really, and perhaps to look into this and make sure we understand as best we can do some of these figures, so we are looking after as best we can do, you know, residents who've got, you know, learning difficulties. And it hits me particularly. My sister-in-law had severe learning difficulties, and she was really lucky. She was with a brilliant employer who would, you know, really look after them, even though what she was doing was virtually nothing. The fact that she had the opportunity to go to work every day was just fantastic. So I think it's something we need to. It's not just the figures, and not just getting things like that. It's making sure that we are supporting as best we can do people in residents of Greater Manchester, which I'm sure which is what you care about as well. Bob, yes, go on.
I mean, just to carry on that point, I mean, we're talking of a target of 230, which will collate to about £18,000 per job, which it would just seem to me that we need to be careful that we don't spend that full amount at achieving the job, as opposed to maybe using only half of it and using the other half to help in the contingency afterwards. People have problems, transport difficulties, getting to a job, which they didn't realise when they started, but then it become more apparent, and they maybe have a caring issue later on, 3 months in. At first, everything's fine and rosy, and then all of a sudden, something happens, child off school and this sort of thing, and it's so easy not to go in. And maybe we ought to look at not sort of, I don't presume you haven't, but 18,000 for getting the job, rather than saying 9 or 10,000 for getting the job, and leaving the rest for follow-ups and care to keep the contingent. Because getting the job is the hardest part, but it's probably just as hard to keep them in that job. So we might just think about not spending all the money at the front end and keeping some of it for the back end, if you pardon, if that sort of sounds right.
Yes, that definitely makes a lot of sense. It shouldn't cost 18,000 to get a job start. It should cost less than that, and then there's and then there's kind of ongoing support, and there's probably differences between the three groups as well. But you're right, you know, obviously this is about long-term support and keeping people in work, and money needs to be spent on that as well. But what we do know from providers is that in terms of sort of unit costing, the job start is the lion's share of the money, and then there's less spent in helping people sustain that employment. But that might differ from case to case.
Right. I'm conscious of the time. The Mayor is due to join us in about 3 or 4 minutes, but we've been asked to give consideration and views on these points on the screen. I presume we're happy for the Special Employment Service to go forward, particularly bearing in mind that if you do it this way around, we get more money coming in from various grants. So are we any observations on that particular point? Good. Sorry?
Just one additional point, Chair.
Sure, yeah, go on.
I'd be grateful if in your work you would absolutely consider all of the equality strands, because I believe, certainly in mental illness, there are matters there, aren't there, particular to women, people in the Black and Asian community. I believe the incidence is fairly notable for people who are LGBT. So I'd be grateful if you would, across all those three, consider all of the equality strands that are pertinent in the work. Thank you.
That's a very fair point, so we can note that in there. The funding split, I've already said, I think, can we duck that? I mean, if the figures are not precise, I don't see how we can possibly make an observation on that.
Is that the population groups question?
Pardon?
Is that the question about the
Yeah, that's right.
One thing that I would say, which might be helpful, so clearly there's a mental health pot that has to be spent on mental health, and at least that amount. But in terms of information on employment rates, when we consider all people with learning disabilities, all autistic people and all people with severe mental illness, the lowest rates of employment are in people with learning disability, followed by people with severe mental illness, followed by autistic people. Yeah, so that might be something that's perhaps not for now, but something that's interesting to consider.
GM-wide service, I think you've already articulated that if we don't do it GM-wide, we lose 1.7 million. So are we happy to support that? The allocation of available places localities based on work and age population size as well. Again, subject to, I suppose the only way you can do it really, but subject to, if you like, that the figure's been verified, if I can say that. I suspect we're supportive of that. And then commission a GMS SCS via a single contract, divided into lots. Now, are we happy with that? I mean,
Was it mentioned that there was an increase in management costs by splitting it? And what kind of percentage is that?
It's probably difficult to give percentages, but I suppose, I mean, what we would say is probably one contract is too few, and 10, if it were to be every geographical area, is probably too many. So we wouldn't want the management costs associated perhaps with 10. So somewhere in between would probably be more sort of pragmatic and sensible, both in terms of keeping an eye on our management costs, but also meaning that smaller providers could tender for the services.
Can you also say in the report as well that it would make sense to align with the 3 mental health trusts that actually cover the whole of Greater Manchester?
Yeah, that's one option. So owing to the fact that half of the money or a huge chunk of the money is mental health, that's one option. The only thing I would say about that is that Wigan's then on its own, because they're northwest boroughs. But it's an option. So it could be 3 or it could be something like 5. We could put 2 geographical areas together, perhaps. So
what's the view of the committee? I mean, I think you probably articulate 10, it would be too many, but probably 1 would be not enough perhaps. So can we just leave it to the people to get an optimum level, say 3 or 4 perhaps?
Just to reiterate, I do think we need to support smaller providers, and I think that's been received.
Okay. We obviously look forward to an update when things are moving forward, and I think it is important that we understand locally what is happening. One other thing, by the way, on this report generally, the first item, I did forget to note that the skills capital is coming back to this committee in either February or January. I can't remember which one it is, and that we will consider, if you like, that funding update at that point in time, rather than this meeting. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for some very interesting reports, and keep up the good work.
Thanks for all the comments.
Now, I've been informed that Andy Burnham, the Mayor, is slightly delayed, but the detail that we've got in the next report, I'm assured that Simon can deal with that. And then when the Mayor comes along, we can ask appropriate questions of the implementation plan and also the wider issues of devolution and the Northern Powerhouse, etc.
I've got used to talking until the Mayor arrives. It's fine. So I just wanted to update you on the GMS implementation plan. This is a 6-month update on the GMS implementation plan. You'll remember that we took a slightly different approach to the Greater Manchester strategy this time round. So we set a strategy till 2020, and then within that we set out what were a small number of actions under each of the 10 priorities that we felt were what we broadly described as transformational actions. Those were the things that we needed to really focus on if we were going to see the kind of change and the targets that we'd set for 2020 to being achieved. Within that approach, we said those were the kind of those headline areas that we needed to focus on. We said we would write a 6-month implementation plan. We'd write an implementation plan which we would update every 6 months. Which we'd never done before, but we felt it was worth doing. And at the time, you and the Local Enterprise Partnership and the CA were very happy with that approach. This is the first 6 months update, so it is very much still kind of work in progress. It's still very much something, an approach that we're trialling. I'm very interested in your feedback. Basically, what we have done for you is 2 things, and you've got 2 bits of information under each of the 10 priorities. The first page under each of the 10 priorities is an update on those key actions that we said we were going to focus on. So we've set out a number of things in each of the 10 priorities where we needed to get to by 2020. And what we would have done within the first 6 months along that journey. And the action plan that you've got sets out, restates where we wanted to get to by 2020. It gives a RAG rating, a red, amber, green rating on that, i.e. are we on track for having delivered that thing by 2020? It gives you what we said we would have done in the first 6 months, what we actually have achieved in the first 6 months, and then says what we will achieve in the next 6 months as well. So it's very much a kind of live document looking at progress on the milestones, what our next milestones are, but importantly, the left-hand column says what did we originally say we needed to have done by 2020, and are we on track for doing that. The second page for each priority gives you the metrics that we've agreed. So that's the charts that look something like that. That gives you the metrics for each priority of the key headline targets that we said we would achieve by 2020, and the supporting indicators that we said we would measure to look at progress. Really important to say that the stats and the actions that we have taken working together actually give, I think, quite a rich picture of where we are in relation to the delivery of the Greater Manchester Strategy. I think there's a lot we can learn for doing it next time round, and some improvements we can make, but obviously really interested in your comments and your feedback. It's also important to say that the data and the actions are not directly comparable. They are all in the same area, but obviously just taking any one of those measures, obviously some of the data is lagged, so actually we know exactly what activity we're doing right up to the last moment, but some of the data is a year out of date or 6 months out of date, so those two things don't always match exactly. And again, because those indicators are primarily national and regional indicators where we can make comparisons, the exact definition of some of those doesn't immediately fall into the or directly feed over into the actions that we're taking. But I think the two together give a fairly rich picture of where we are. I guess in terms of the key areas of interest for this committee, we've outlined those in the report across a number of different GMS priorities. The things I just wanted to highlight were, in terms of priority 2, young people equipped for life. In many ways, you've heard a lot about that this afternoon already. In terms of priority 3, the one area that I think we are concerned about is the apprenticeships and the volume of apprenticeships, and again we've talked about that already. In priority 4, on the good economy, I think one of the difficulties we've got here is that quite a few of the actions that we said we would take are broadly green, and the things around kind of leadership and management programs and overall work that we're doing in industrial strategy, etc., are all green. And indeed, most of the targets are actually green in terms of our progress. But we know that we've got the B word about to happen, and therefore actually we face a period of this considerable uncertainty. At the moment, investment levels and companies' recruitment plans, etc., are holding up reasonably well. But we know that a lot of companies are saying they are feeling increasingly uncertain about what's going to happen, and therefore, and actually some economic commentators who are saying that one of the reasons the economy is holding up so well at the moment is because actually companies we know are stockpiling, so they're actually buying goods in advance of needing them, and therefore almost by definition after March we will end up in a period of lower growth because companies will then use the goods that they have stockpiled. So we think that although the kind of it all looks pretty green in terms of priority 4, the Brexit uncertainty means that we need to watch that one very carefully to see what happens after March. In terms of priority 7, obviously the main focus there for you is culture, where I think you had an update a couple of months ago, and I think you've got another update coming in next month as well, but broadly things are on track. And then again on priority 10, it's around an age-friendly Greater Manchester, where again a lot of that links back to the skills agenda and the work agenda, which you've recently had an update on. So that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction, and obviously hand over to Andy.
Let me just add to that. One thing first of all, that our priorities are priorities 2, 3, 4, 7 and 10. So I don't particularly want to stray off that in terms of detail. And before, if you like, I'll let you answer some questions in detail. And if you want to, I think, given the time we're at, it might be worthwhile as well doing this together with the Mayor's update, in fact. So what I would suggest in that case, that I could ask Andy Byrne, the Mayor, just perhaps give a State of the Nation address, perhaps? a short sort of brief summary of 18 months down the track. What's gone well, what's gone not so well, perhaps.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll try and keep it short so we can get into questions. As I sit here today, though, I increasingly feel like Greater Manchester might be the last bastion of stable government in England if things carry on as they are. it's interesting for me, 18 months in, how I think more people are engaging at the devolved level, because obviously it's uncertain where things are at a national level. And hopefully, I think as we come through this difficult period, I think devolution, might get a new lease of life, I think, for that reason. You know, as we try and put confidence back and energy back into the regions, I think we're well placed, hopefully, to benefit from that. 18 months in, what's gone well, what's gone not so well? Well, I'll come on to transport in a minute, but what's gone well, I think, as Simon has just been outlining, there is a clear plan here that has got identifiable goals and measurable targets alongside it. So, you know, that is quite a big thing. You know, we've got a big vision. I think we know where we're going as Greater Manchester. The challenge now is, can we do it? Can we deliver? And I think that's the challenge for the CA, if I'm honest. You know, in the early days, the CA was analytical in terms of what it did, and it was making the case for devolution to government. It's a different thing to become a doing body working with the districts and sort of developing strategies that are then implemented. And I think that's the test that we're in. Not necessarily on the committee's brief, but you know, homelessness has been a big priority. I think there's a growing evidence in that space of clarity joined up district to here that is a plan that then is beginning to make a difference on the ground. In the committee's brief, I think that there is success in terms of the economic brief and the economic agenda. Obviously visible around the city, some big wins in terms of inward investment recently. We have a developing agenda around life readiness and young people, priority 2, which I think is only going to grow in importance as we get through Brexit and into next year. You know, how do you demonstrate that there is a talent pipeline from schools and colleges into these industries that we want to build? So the team are working hard on our bridge GM system, and as part of that, the UCAS style system for apprenticeships. I still am working hard to see if we can find a way of funding the bus pass, which actually I'm calling an opportunity pass for 16 to 18-year-olds. So that will be linking travel to free entry to cultural or sporting or educational opportunities. So lots of work going on in that space, and I think it becomes more and more important all the while. We have a mentally healthy schools pilot, which is, again, providing counselling in secondary schools, which is being rolled out, again, recognising this call from young people for more, what they would say, life advice, life support. It's a very, very loud call and gets louder all of the time. So on that agenda, I think there is a growing case that we've got a good story. On the economy, we're developing the industrial strategy, and that's progressing well. Transport, not directly in the committee's brief, but obviously it supports a strong economy. You know, you asked me what's not going so well, and that would be the big thing that I would point to. I think it's obvious. I don't think it needs much explanation. I suppose it's a reflection of where we've reached, isn't it, as a city region. We are emerging, I think, physically as a world-class city region, but we don't have a transport system to match. And all I can say to you all is that sitting where I sit, it's very evident that I don't have the levers to make either the modes of transport work better individually, but certainly not to integrate them one to another. You know, making buses work to time to support Metrolink and having the Oyster styles, you just can't do that stuff. I've been saying recently that we don't have basic controls over the roads. You know, we can't enforce yellow box junctions like they can in London. We can't have lane rental on the utility company so that they don't overrun on roadworks. And we don't have the tools in the box that allow us to run our system. We're still waiting for the government order to allow us to move ahead with bus reform. Taxi regulation is something we're debating, but until you get rid of the provision that means any taxi can work anywhere, we're not going to be able to raise standards or integrate taxis with the rest of our transport offer and trains, well, that's a whole story of its own. So that, I would say, is 18 months in, is the thing that I think is from the committee's point of view, the biggest barrier, potentially. This is the thing that will hold Greater Manchester back if we don't get better answers. Just very lastly, if I could very quickly, I don't think there's any reference in your papers to the spending review. I think we do need to think about what's our next stage of devolution as Greater Manchester. I think we do need more transport powers, as I've just been saying, but I am looking at, with the other mayors, we've agreed that we'll make a joint case, the 8 Metro mayors, including Sadiq Khan, for devolution of post-16. We're getting the adult skills budget next April, but we think it's in some ways picking up the pieces just to deal with the adult skills budget. Post-16 is what we need. We need to build a coherent skills system from 16 through 19 into adult education. And there'll be a joint case being made there, but it would be obviously useful to build that with you. Secondly, I think DWP devolution is now urgent because our place-based working in the districts is a bit held back by the lack of the universal credit and all the challenges we face there. And I think those two things should be a big pitch to the government for more devolution as part of the spending review next year. So I suppose in summary, well, I'm glad to be out of Westminster. I think it's number one. I think that's an obvious thing, I think, given the where it's up to. No, I think my summary is we've made a good start in terms of up to the midterm. We can point to some genuine success, but the big test is really coming now. Can we deliver on those things that Simon was reeling off? And it's up to me and the people in this building, working with your colleagues in the districts, to show that we can.
Questions, which could be either about the Greater Manchester Strategy implementation, or it can be direct questions to the Mayor in relation to, if you like, as it says on the agenda, the mayoral update, Northern Powerhouse and devolution. So first I got is Danny, and then if you just put your hands up so I can get you all noted down. Okay.
Thank you for coming, Andy. So it's just a quick question about building the whole of Greater Manchester as one of the we're the second biggest economy outside of London. We need to carry on pushing that. And the problem is obviously with the B word, with Brexit, the amount of money that we've received from Europe in the past has made our economy grow. And it's like you're saying, we've had some presentations today about what's come from the EU and the money that's come from the EU. And the problem is obviously after Brexit, we need to carry on what we're doing, building our economies and building them outside of Manchester as well, i.e. Rochdale. So it's actually on, I know we said the priorities, it's actually on priority 6, so I do completely apologise for this. But it's to do with the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. Obviously, with the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, that unlocks land for business, for housing, to build economy, to bring people into our area. And it's like you're saying, with transport for Rochdale, maybe that might lead to HS3, hopefully, from Liverpool to Hull. So what I'm trying to say is, obviously, there has been delays with the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, which would actually help us build an economy after Brexit. So I just wondered, what is the actual timeline for the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework now, and where is it going to lead? And where's it going to lead us to in the future, i.e. up to 2020?
We do actually have an interest in that because of the impact on employment, in fact. So it is relevant, actually.
Highly relevant, Chair, to this committee. And it's a very, very fair question. The answer is we are moving, I hope, towards an agreement that will then allow us to publish early in the new year. We're, though, due to discuss it on Tuesday with leaders, so it's not finally sort of nailed down. We are wanting this time to do a much better, if I could put it this way, I can say it because I wasn't here at the time, but obviously a much better job in my view than was done last time. And what I mean by that is having a spatial framework that is more realistic in terms of what what is fair, if you like, to communities. So, development that's more sustainable because it's closer to public transport and just hangs together better. But alongside that, we are wanting to publish a housing vision policy, so that not just how many numbers of homes are we building, what type of homes are we trying to build, and that was not clear last time. We want an infrastructure plan. So obviously utilities, digital, and then not as part of the infrastructure plan, but a separate transport plan is the aim, isn't it, Simon? So we want to kind of pull that together so that it is a more compelling sort of thought through vision for how Greater Manchester supports growth with the infrastructure and transport to match. We were grateful to the government for an extra just about £70 million in the budget for transport. So we have a Transforming Cities Fund, as you might know at the moment, which is heavily linked to cycling and walking. That was the early priority. But we've got funding now for financial year 22-23. This £70 million falls there. And my intention, to be agreed and discussed with leaders and indeed with yourselves today, is to, in many ways, allocate it to local transport improvements to help the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework. So if we can add, for instance, new Metrolink stops in certain localities, if we can fund new train stations, parkway or park and ride at train stations, or even Metrolink stops, the guided busway in Lee, is there another way, is there somewhere else that could get a similar scheme? So that's our thinking with the spatial framework, to tie it all together in a more convincing plan that supports economic development. And in your borough, Councillor Meredith, we've got Middleton and the whole question of extension of Metrolink to Middleton. Now, we need to have a look at how that might feature in the spatial framework and the transport plan, and how quickly we could fund that. I think I could say to you today I would want to do it. If we could identify the funding, we would do it, because I think it's also part of Northern Gateway 1. It would make sense. So this is all in the mix, and this will all be in the discussion as we get to the final consideration of the revised spatial framework, because it will be revised. It will reduce the green belt take, but then alongside the other policies that will support a credible approach. You mentioned Brexit though, and we had the ONS figures on population. If we are heading towards a poor deal or no deal, I think the projections for growth in the economy of no deal were, I think, Northwest on the government's projections minus 12%. So 12, yeah. So it's kind of, the spatial framework will land in the middle of that, and we've got to make it credible without choking off growth, if you know what I mean. You see what I mean? You've got to find the balance, and we're working hard to get the balance right.
Bob. Thanks, Andy.
Bob.
Can we just have a quick look at priority 2, young people equipped for life? You make a statement there, or Simon does, by 2020 we will meet or exceed the national average. I presume attainment 8 is progress 8, as I know it in Bury. What makes you so sure that as a combined authority we'll exceed our progress 8 target or national average? Because the feedback I'm getting, especially in the Bury education system, that's not going to happen. Sorry, it's page. Well, it's on your targets, GMS targets. Priority 2, young people. By 2020, we will meet or exceed the national average attainment 8 score per pupil.
68, sorry. Oh, sorry, I've got you. Yeah.
So you're making a statement that we will be higher than the national average on progress 8. I mean, could you explain to me how you arrived at that assumption?
So that's not an assumption that we will be there. That's the target that we've set ourselves. Is that we need to be. That's our target. Is that by 2020 we believe that to have a prosperous modern economy we need to be achieving those levels. And the action plan is then how are we going to get there? And that's why we're saying about are we making the progress enough?
And just if I may add a little, because obviously there is limited power or involvement I can have in terms of secondary schools and curriculum and all of those things. But it goes back to the stuff I was talking about earlier around life readiness and the transition for young people from secondary school into study or training or work. I think that's how we can have an influence on the secondary school system if young people have more confidence about what is there for them at the end of school. I've referred quite a lot to a survey that was shown to the Greater Manchester Reform Board a few months ago, whereby we surveyed 300 young people in year 10, I believe, about their own feelings about the future. And one of the questions they were asked was, do you have hope for your own future? And it was quite sobering to see the results. 40% couldn't answer positively. And I think that's the issue, isn't it? I think the current drift of the school system works very well for the high achievers, English baccalaureate, university route. But when you get to those middle teenage years, if you're not on that route, schools start to feels like they disinvest a bit from those young people who are not on that, and then they lose their way, and then they lose hope, and I think that's a big issue. So it's a stretch for us, but I think having this, we are wanting to develop a very ambitious careers advice, careers support, this UCAS system for apprenticeship, so that young people who want an apprenticeship can apply in the same way that young people can for university. The bus pass is meant to help with that, to keep hopes up that they can progress beyond school. So that one is a challenge given we don't have devolved control, but let's be honest, if we don't do something in that space, the 40% who don't have hope are people at risk of gangs, of antisocial behaviour, worklessness, all the issues that then we deal with. And NEETs as well, absolutely. So I think this agenda has been neglected, to be honest with you, by all parties nationally. And, it's one thing promising a lot for university students. Well, what about this group of young, what about this group of young people? And I think devolution works if it corrects national weaknesses or failings. And I think technical education has never been properly promoted in this country. And I think we should try, particularly linking it to the industrial strategy, to see if we can, come forward with more convincing answers. Just very quickly, Chair, just sorry to indulge you, but it goes back to what Danny was saying before. We are going to get, we believe, in replacement of European funds, something called the Shared Prosperity Fund, which we think, or the mayors anyway, are lobbying for it to be the same level at European funding, but devolved. So it is possible, or by no means certain, that we could soon have a fund that can be used much more flexibly to support industry, careers, skills, and we're waiting to hear more about that. But that was, sorry, I just wanted to mention that to you, that there is a replacement coming that is most likely going to be devolved to the GM level.
On the problem of NEETs, it was an interesting fact that Manchester City has got a 5.3% unknown NEET population, and that was I just wondered whether anybody could cast any light on that. It just seemed so high.
I mean, that was a point I picked up as well, Simon. I don't know if you know about, if you can answer that, in that analysis there are a lot of, not just Manchester, a lot of them where, not known basically. Why is that?
I'd have to check the exact answer, but my understanding is that some years ago they changed the way in which young people were followed up, and there used to be a requirement to follow up every young person. That requirement now doesn't exist. That requirement to follow up every young person isn't still there. So we follow up those people and try to find people, but if we can't find them, then we don't know about them, which is why they then get recorded as not known. So it's a change in the way that data has been, or the requirements on following up every young person effectively.
Over a period of time, that figure hopefully will come down when we understand what the figures actually mean better.
Potentially, although actually it's about whether or the resources put to tracking young people effectively.
Potentially the right word, actually. Susan.
Thank you. So I want to ask about and speak to devolution priorities. You've said that post-16 finance for skills, for skills for education, if you like, is a priority. And then you also said Department for Work and Pensions finance. So I actually want to say to you that I think that the priority you've given to improving the sad situation of those that have homelessness as an issue and street sleeping and so on is such an important aspect of social justice. Do you see why I hone in more on a desire to see the Department for Work and Pensions budget devolved for GMCA and yourself, for Mayor, to take charge of in Greater Manchester? That is not to say that, of course, I don't support devolution for post-16, but in a sense I'm lobbying you now and trying to get a feel from you as to whether there will have to be a decision on which you take forward for Greater Manchester, because you know, you yourself, I'm focusing so much on where we need to improve in terms of social justice, or where we can improve in terms of social justice. And surely the terrific problems that are being experienced across the welfare landscape, not just universal credit, benefit cap, bedroom tax, all of the limitations that many have been suffering now for a good number of years because of the colossal changes in welfare, surely we could do a much better job in Greater Manchester. And if you can say anything more about that and why you see that I hone in on that as a priority for this city region, I'd be grateful.
I think it's both, Sue. But let me just say, though, I think we can point already that we can do it better. So working well is an initiative we've been running for 3 years, I think now. This is an element of DWP, devolution, that effectively was the work programme. And we had an agreement to focus on those longest out of the labour market. And the scheme that we developed, working with health colleagues, in some ways turned the DWP approach on its head. You know, so the kind of tick box sort of thing, ATOS and work capability, it kind of went away from that and has gone to a much more supportive approach based around mental health support, talking therapies, I think mentoring, and the figures that I've seen show that we've had a double the success rate that the DWP gets from its programme with regard to the work programme. So I think there's a kernel there of saying that is a better way of doing things, and if we were to apply that more broadly to the DWP budget, you know, that we could spend that money better, and actually we would spend it more through our local organisations, the voluntary sector that we know well. You know, imagine the power of that if that DWP budget was really being run through the local organisations of Greater Manchester. And really linked to the place-based teams in the localities, you know, where DWP funding is being used to support what everyone else is trying to do. There's another link, of course, to the private rented sector. A huge amount of public money just goes into the pockets of landlords that I'm afraid don't even maintain the homes to a decent, safe standard. So that is another thing, isn't it? If we had more control of the DWP budget, I think we could drive up standards in the private rented sector. But here's why I say so I do believe we can show that we would use the DWP budget to better effect, both by adopting a different approach to supporting people, but also by linking it to our wider public service reform agenda. We will get more efficiency for the DWP money. But the reason I say both is, and this goes actually to the heart of my work on homelessness and the learning that I've taken from it, it's got to be just picking people up and putting them in a shelter is not enough. You've got to hold out that hope to people that they can kind of move back, move on and get skills or retrain to get into something that's a better life for them. And so, it's interesting because I've, in the first 18 months, really focused on what I would call the respite, immediate support, get people off the streets, bed every night. Obviously, we're very grateful to the 10 districts for the support that's been given there. Figures are that we've got about 130 people using the bed every night accommodation at the moment. Already some people have been rehoused through that. And then we've got Housing First, which we're about to introduce, which is then a step further beyond that immediate respite. It's more a recovery provision, you might call it, where you get help. But unless you've got something then to offer people around, and then we'll train you to do this. And we're working with employers across the city now to see, well, how many are prepared to offer supported employment for people who've been recently homeless? For me, it's about you've got to keep offering something at every stage if you're really to help people make that journey fully away from the street. So it is about the DWP system, but it also is about hopes, skills, the future. And I think it's seeing them all as one system, really, I think, is where it makes most sense.
Luke.
Thank you. More of a technical point, really. I think this presentation, this dashboard is actually really helpful for me. I find it really quite clear. I've seen lots of dashboards. We see them all the time, actually. It's notably probably one of the better ones I've seen, if not the best. So it's really good to see things that are kind of out of your control, but you're measuring and keeping an eye on, and also the things that you're doing side by side. I think that's actually really good. My question is related to priority 4, the first target about productivity, essentially GVA per job. Was there a reason why it wasn't per hour? They are slightly different and quite importantly different given the state of our labour market. Also, why would you do it in real terms? Inflation is a bit dodgy at a regional, let alone a local level. And why change versus the baseline, not compared to nationally? And also, why is the source the forecasting model? I know that's probably one of the few sources that you have over a longer period of time, but there are national data sets that you can use for this. And also, I suppose that relates to those questions around the real terms change. It's not necessarily the best way to measure that. Thanks.
I will come back to you with a technical response to that, because there's been a lot of argument about that particular measure as to exactly how we measure it, exactly what we're measuring. So, and my colleagues have been around that circle a few times. So probably if I just do a note to you to explain why that was the one we ended up choosing, that's probably the easiest way to answer it.
Oh, good question. Yvonne.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, Andy.
Hi, Yvonne.
I'm particularly concerned about young people going into care and the numbers that are going into care. Now, I see that there's a very ambitious target there, that there's going to be a reduction of 20%, in the next couple of years, or the next 18 months, really. And if I'm afraid if I look at my local figures, it's nothing like that. In fact, it's going up all the time. And the numbers going into care are a huge indication of, as we know, of poverty within our communities. And I have a particular concern about the number of children who are hovering just below being taken into care, and if they should be, in fact, be taken into care when we all seem so nervous about increasing the numbers. That they, in fact, a lot more children, in fact, should be in those numbers. And that's my first concern. But also, if we're talking about employment, we know that young people coming out of care, they really have everything stacked against them. And I'm sure that you talk about with NEETs, getting into drugs and gangs and all that. It's times 10 for somebody coming out of care. It's so difficult to try and place young people in care. In decent employment. So I think that it's the usual thing, really. Now that we have the combined authority, I'm looking for a model where we all work together with this, because, I say we've had our local difficulties in Tameside with children's services, but what's come out of it and the drilling down into the figures is just how bad it is. And when you speak to colleagues from other authorities, You know, they're perhaps not as honest as we've had to be, but it's bad, and it's our future. It's so important. But I would like to hear your views on that.
I think you're absolutely right to say that we need to focus much more on young people who've been in care. Maybe I ask Simon to sort of explain the indicator after, as to why that was chosen, whether it's realistic for us to get adoption services to the point where that we would be able to achieve that. But from the young people leaving care point of view, you're right. I've met too many, Yvonne, on the streets of the city centre when I do my walk around homelessness. People like to claim that homeless people are all this or they're all that. To the extent that they're all anything, many have been in care at some point, and that is one thing that really is a kind of common thread. Life has become tougher for everybody, particularly for young people. It's more stressful these days, isn't it? It's more pressure on young people. But if you haven't got a mum and dad to fall back on, it's not surprising, I don't think, these days that it's scarily easy for those young people to fall right down very quickly, isn't it? And many do, sadly. So this is a big issue, and it is something where I think we can set a new lead through devolution in saying, what is it? What is our job to be the parent of these young people? What are the basics that other young people get, and how can we replicate those basics through what we might do? I made a point a few weeks ago going down to the launch of the Care Leavers Covenant to support the minister who's brought that through, because I think it's a really important initiative, and I said to him I'd be very keen to show the cross-party support for that. And what we've all committed to do through the Reform Board is develop a Care Leavers guarantee. So could we develop building through the covenant, could we set a guarantee to our care leavers as to what stuff we will make sure they get? Because we had a round table with them recently, and they were all saying it's all unclear what we just end up sort of not knowing what and it's very difficult. And I think we should be challenging ourselves as a GM system. For instance, can we guarantee them a job or an apprenticeship? The GMP have got a lot, the NHS has got a lot, yourselves, districts have a lot, fire service, there aren't that many care leavers every year, and I think I think there is an offer we should be developing or thinking about there. A home, should we be guaranteeing them a home? Because how else, the risk of them coming through and then not, again, with our housing providers, should we be guaranteeing that? But it's also more practical things, just one of the things they called for was a mentor that they could always fall back on. That time when you're late on Sunday night and your electricity's run out and you've no one to, or you just, I don't know, when you're in that panic, when the person you ring is your mum, I still do it occasionally. Could we give that by matching them with a mentor? An interesting example was given from Oldham, actually. I think a young person presented an idea to Oldham Council, I believe, this week or the week before, who'd had mental health problems, because often that's quite a common thing. And he was saying, he couldn't afford his prescriptions for antidepressants when he'd left care. And he didn't take them because he just couldn't get them. And he was saying, shouldn't care leavers get free prescriptions? And I don't know if we could afford it, but we should certainly look at it, because that's our job, isn't it, to be the corporate parent and to provide a range of support that they know they can fall back on. I think Rochdale, they were the first council anyway that I remember doing the exemption from council tax. And I think most of our boroughs now have adopted that, and it's really good practice. So I think we've got to build, building up that guarantee, I think, would be a really good thing, because it's not all about pressures on councils, because we can get the NHS and police and fire and others to play into it, and the housing providers. So it's definitely something we're building up. On the bit about fewer looked after children, Simon, do you want to say how we came to that indicator?
So I'll have to give you the calculation that sits behind that. The stats team have looked at that, and definitely that will be relating. That'll be about an average somewhere else. It'll be or a national average or something. So we've tried to not just say percentage reductions the whole time, where we can give numbers. So it's 1,000 fewer children. But it'll be calculated from that kind of basis of achieving a national average or something like that. So again, I'll come back to you on that one.
Just very quickly, we have been asked by the Department for Education to establish a care leavers trust, and also, as you'll all know, a children's board. So that infrastructure isn't quite in place yet, is it? I think it's just beginning to develop, and I think these priorities will very much come under the focus of the children's board. So I think, if we're honest, we haven't quite got the machinery in place really to get the focus on these indicators, but they're obviously the right ones to set.
Karen.
Thank you. Very nice to see you again.
You too, Karen.
Thank you. Just a couple of points. Can you please hurry up with your spatial strategy? Because I'm sick of the big landowners going to appeals and saying, because you haven't got your spatial strategy, the local authority hasn't got their local plan in place. So we've won, by the way, Broadoak, but that was the point that company actually used. Yep. So I'm pleased to see that it might be coming around about January, which I'm delighted about. My other point was about the homeless. We just say homeless and we don't categorise what they are. You know, you've told us about young people, you've got people who've got mental health problems, you've also got prisoners who are coming out who can't manage their lives, and you've got them on the streets as well. So it is a way of moving people forward. But when we did something in our borough years ago, some of these people quite like being on the streets. So how do we actually try and help them to realise that, you know, we closed the main place here coming into Manchester, and we gave them apartments, and they were having real difficulty. So you've got to have people behind you that can actually help, and I think the mentor business is excellent. But the other thing that always concerns me as authority is we asked the children at 16 to leave, children who are in care. I never pulled my children out, I never threw them out. They still come home, you know, and I think we have to look at, you know, we are the parents of these children and we should be protecting them and not, they need to have, all right, they may have to leave care, but then they should be going into a halfway house, right, where they can actually get some of the skills that they may need. But we've never, as parents, ever threw our children out at 16. So why are we actually doing it? I'd like to throw mine out at times, but, you know, you didn't do, did you? You didn't sort of say, well, go on, you've got to find your own way now, and I think that we need to be looking at that. Yeah, I would have liked to throw mine out at times.
One of mine's just gone, so yeah, I know, it's a strange feeling. Well, no, thanks, thank you, Karen. I mean, on the GMSF, it has been obviously a frustrating process for everybody. The bit that has most been difficult has been the way in which the government have been moving the goalposts on us at the very, you know, we've had ONS figures, and then we had a government methodology on the ONS figures, and it's been a bit of a moving sort of feast, really, all year, if we're honest. But I think we've got enough agreement and stability now, it feels like we have, to be able now to move to a decision and move to a publication. And that we hope will be early in the new year, although to be agreed, because it hasn't been fully discussed again. You know, leaders will discuss it again on Tuesday, as I say. So, no, I hear absolutely what you say, and I will reflect on that. If we're, you know, if we're not, you know, we just need to do this thing now and get it out there and move forward. But in a way that doesn't leave it open to challenge again, you know, because obviously we need to have it needs to be robustly based on the latest figures and methodology, as well as being convincing on air quality, for instance. So, you know, air quality, as you'll all know, is a growing issue. We're being asked to develop an air quality plan. We won't put ourselves in a good position if we're building lots of homes in areas where air quality is poor and we don't have public transport options for those new homes. You know, so there is a thing here about being consistent and joined up really in the way that we're approaching it. But I absolutely hear what you say. On homelessness, I think you're absolutely right. It's a range of provision is what's needed, recognising that you can't generalise for the people who are out there on the streets. You know, they are very different with very different needs. It was put to me by the team that have been working on the Bed Every Night accommodation that we needed more women-only provision, because for some young women, the thought of going into a hostel or a shelter where there isn't proper security feels less safe than the street, and that might be a reason why they may not go in. There's the whole issue of dogs. So I'm very proud that Salford has got some dog pods this year, which is a very impressive lead, and that's been welcomed. I think there's a need for more provision for young people. What we have learned as we've gone along is you won't succeed unless you give a range of different type of provision that then means that everyone's got something that they can feel is right. So we've just got to keep working at this all the time. And the mental health support is crucial. I think homelessness is effectively a mental health issue, because it's either mental health that is at the root cause of trauma in people's lives linked, that then causes a mental health problem that then leads to the homelessness. Or, you know, if you've just spent 1 or even 2 nights out on the street, your mental health is pretty severely impacted by that experience, and then therefore it causes a mental health problem if there wasn't one there before. So, you know, I agree with you. We're on a journey around homelessness, but the progress is huge, and you know, with the continued sense of collective commitment around this issue, then I'm confident that we continue to make progress.
Right, I'm going to exercise my discretion as chair. Rather than run out of time, I've asked no questions yet. And I've got one substantive question, 2 small questions. It's not in our area, but it's so important. It's probably the most important area of all, is the integration of health and social care. Regrettably, it's one of the few that's got a red on the RAG rating. And it's in relation, it's the barriers towards the change. It's on page 88. If anybody wants, the barriers towards change and to get the integration working. This is absolutely fundamental, not just for Greater Manchester, for the whole of the healthcare sector. And I'll disclose, you know, if an interest in one sense, that I used to be on the board of the Pen and Acute Trust, so I've got some, you know, reasonable knowledge of healthcare. And what worries me is a word in there called barriers. And one of the problems in health can be shifting culture and changing, if you like, attitudes. We've always done it this way, and therefore why should we be doing it a different way? And what I'd like to know is, what is your sense of how things are really progressing in this area? And, you know, I mean, do you detect that there are barriers there, you know, in terms of, you know, cultural attitudes? And secondly, what do you think good would look like, you know, when all this, you know, beds down in hopefully a fairly short period of time? Because that's the way, you know, if the health system isn't going to collapse, you know, for the UK as a whole, you actually need to make sure that integrated health and social care absolutely works totally.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, it's the right issue to focus on, and the reason it's red, I think it's a reflection that all boroughs are not in the same place. I think, you know, I think it was an honest reflection of where we are. There is some really good practice out there. I think it's fair to name-check Tameside in this regard, a health and care system that has moved on massively from the time I was in the Department of Health 10 years ago. You know, this is a transformed system. Salford, obviously, we know about. But I think the reason why it's red is it's too patchy, and I think that's been acknowledged. And I also think, though, pressure on local government social care budgets mean that the money is not necessarily there to bring the change that we would want to see. We did make a bid last year to the government around what we were calling Care 2020, which was a bid to remodel and change the way the finance of the system works to support a different model of care, which wasn't successful, and I think that maybe slightly stalled our plans. But to come on to the second part of your question, what does good look like? I'm quite clear about that. It for me means it means around the individual who needs support, a multidisciplinary team in the home, and a team that works to support that person where they want to be, and that very much individualises their support. Wigan are doing some good work at the moment on, I think it's called well-being teams. Charlie will know about this. I think, is that right? Has it gone all across the borough? Yeah. I saw one in Ashton, and it's really interesting because it's moving away from the 15-minute visit production line approach. And these teams, as I understand it, are very much about building the social capital around the individuals. You know, if Mr. X wants to go to church on a Sunday, well, could a neighbour take, you know, and you build more support using the agency of people working in care as opposed to just, you know, this kind of like 15-minute sort of, you know, thing that doesn't really work. So there is good thinking out there, but that's for me that's what good looks like. And it's social care being fully part of the mix, part of the team, and not operating in a sort of separate little world to the rest of the public sector. I would love to see boroughs step forward and say, we want to break out of this commissioning model of the 15-minute visit domiciliary care, because it isn't good enough. We've all kind of ended up in it because of the finances. My big hope, to answer your question, is we should fundamentally change now the way finance works in the NHS. So for those with the greatest needs, particularly disabled or older people, move to a different model of payment, which is not episodic payment, i.e. payment by results every time somebody goes into hospital, but a year of care approach to funding, into which you could mix the local government element of support. Because if you were to kind of commission in that way, probably through the NHS as the accountable body, you would create an incentive then, financial incentive, to support people in the home rather than treat them in a hospital bed. And I think that until that big change comes with a financial reform, I think social care won't take a sort of major leap forward. I think it's still going to be stuck in a fairly unsatisfactory place. But it is a big priority for me. I think it does require renewed focus to start to move the agenda forward. I think we should be saying as a city region that we want to abolish the 15-minute visit culture. We don't want a 0 hours culture in social care. We want social care as part of the public service family, part of the team, in the home, preventative, person-centred care. You know, we can't do it overnight, but that should be our journey that we're moving towards.
The two other points were fairly small points. One that was raised, in fact, in a previous meeting where we debated things. It's on the Northern Powerhouse, and a suggestion that perhaps we ought to be looking at across the northern footprint to have research and development and innovation as a further priority policy area. I don't think specifically we've got that. And it's perhaps something you could look into, because if you think about what we've got across the north, whether it be pharmaceuticals, the aeronautical industries, the nuclear industry, there's some great strengths actually, and it's something that we've got within Greater Manchester level. I think it's making that wider in the Northern Powerhouse. Simon.
Just specifically on that point, since your last meeting, there's, I think I mentioned there's an organisation called MP11, which is the 11 LEP chairs that now meet together, and they are progressing work, and one of the topics that they want to progress is innovation across the north.
And the other thing...
Another thing sorry, Chair, just very briefly to refer you to is an expert panel that we have set up alongside the local industrial strategy process, with some very significant names on it. Trying to remember all of them. Mariana Mazzucato, who's Stephanie Flanders, people may remember as the BBC's economics correspondent, Ed Glazer, some very big figures, and what they are doing is reviewing the evidence about industrial strength as part of our work. So they're feeding that in to the local industrial strategy. And it's obviously going back to the Manchester Independent Economic Review, the Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review. So you're right, we do see the importance of what you've just said.
And the last point is on page 75, and I probably raised this before, Simon, but we're simply comparing how we're doing into the GVA per job. And we're noting in there, we're nearly £5,000 below the UK average of 49,000. We'll never get there. I mean, because of the southeast, we're more so London, I would guess. And I just wonder if the figures ought to be comparing, to the UK, excluding London, perhaps. I mean, because target should be, realistic and, attainable with a push. And I just wonder if, including London, it's not attainable. Now, I'll leave it to the economic experts to look into that. But it's London, because of financial service in particular, completely distorts the whole picture.
The short answer to that question, the target is very clearly set, and it almost comes back to what Luke was saying earlier. The target is set about 6% change from our baseline rather than a comparator to the UK average. So that's why we set the target not relative to the UK average, or not to close the gap relative to the UK average. The 5,000 is just noted as that's how far behind the UK average we are. The difficulty, and it is a judgment call, the difficulty about taking a UK target excluding London is that effectively says we want to be the best outside of London, and London's a completely separate case. And while you might argue that's true, actually we should be saying, we want to be aspiring to the kinds of levels, not of London, but of the whole of the UK, i.e. we should be trying to get up to the UK average. So it's a matter of debate as to whether you say, you want to be higher than the rest of the UK excluding London. I think saying you want to be the average of the UK excluding London would not be ambitious enough. And actually certainly the LEP and the CA members have challenged us to be more ambitious in some of these targets rather than less.
We're nothing if not ambitious, as you can tell from the from all of the stats. I just mentioned I had an event at Mansion House this week with the City of London Mayor, Lord Mayor, where we were discussing the Greater Manchester Local Industrial Strategy. It's interesting, they're reaching out to us because they recognise that in this period now, if London is still seen as the area, the area that gets everything, they recognise that there'll be resentment towards London and the rest of the country, and they're, I think, making an effort to reach out. But it was recognised at this seminar that we held at Mansion House that by some that Greater Manchester may have a more attractive proposition in terms of accommodation, quality of life, and also is increasingly getting the jobs that are of sufficient quality that attract those highly sought after graduates. So yeah, I think we are, there's definitely change going on out there. I think there are, we are more competitive for some of those London-style jobs maybe than we would have been in the past. So yeah, we're aiming high.
And I think particularly if you're on quality of life.
Yeah, I think if the local industrial strategy is to succeed, we've got to do more on graduate retention. We think, building more and more the sense that the people who come here, the very best and the brightest, are then staying here and building their businesses here, and I think that's should be a big theme of the local industrial strategy.
I'm conscious of the time.
I don't mind one more if you want to.
I was just going to say, you threw at the end of the LAC discussion, you threw the odd thing about central government asking you to set up a children's board. I just wondered how that would sit within the 10 combined authorities children's boards. Have they said that to you?
So we had the Department for Education, I think, originally wanted a single children's director. I think, and that wasn't, acceptable to the districts. And they were kind of offering funding to improve children's services, but they were trying to put these conditions on it. And I think where we got to in the end with the department, in discussion with the leaders, was that the board should be a board of the districts, not of the combined authority. And effectively, I think that's how I think I'm right in saying that it's being established in that way. So it's not actually much, well, it isn't, obviously we were interested in it here, but it's not necessarily a CA entity, it's a district run entity. But of course it needs to link to our work on school readiness and the work we were mentioning around life readiness and young people. So yeah, I mean, it's been set up in that way. I think with the fair challenge that there needs to be more standardisation of service levels across children's services and standardisation of practice, working with Greater Manchester Police and others, you know, getting those relationships right. And yeah, so it's work in progress. I'm not sure, has it met, Simon? I think yeah, I think it has, is what I think. I think there is a board in place now. It's probably had 1 or 2 meetings, but it's early days anyway.
Thank you, Andy. That's very helpful. Give us some straight answers, which is good. And we'd like you to come back if you're happy to in 6 months' time, perhaps.
Absolutely, I'll come as often as the committee feels it's useful to. We've got a big 6 months ahead of us, though, with all of these things that I was mentioning. Clean air we haven't touched on today. For you as well, local industrial strategy. I mean, I would be open to, if the committee wants more involvement in that, we would be happy to facilitate.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Good, we'll take that up.
Good. Okay.
Thanks. Thank you. So we've finished then, apart from the item for information only, which is the local industrial strategy update, but that is coming back in a final update for the March meeting. So that is why this is for information purposes only. And finally, I guess to note, the date and time of next meeting, which is on Friday the 7th of December, earlier than normal, at 2 o'clock, normal sort of time I should start, but it's in the council chamber again in Manchester Town Hall. So we'll have to try and find our way in there again.
They don't like us in there.
Thank you for your attendance and thank you for some good scrutiny questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm about to see him now.
You're passing now. I just said it's a homeless charity.
That's fine.